Well, hey folks. Today I would like to talk about how we got into the nutritional predicament that we are in. What we're going to listen to today is a conversation between Dr. Mark Hyman and Nina Teicholz. Nina Teicholz is a investigative journalist, former vegan, and Mark Hyman is, I think he's also a former vegan. But what they're talking about is, well, the title of the YouTube video is The Science and Politics of Nutrition.
In your book, it was fascinating because you really unearthed the origin story of why we came to believe that fat was bad. And you kind of turned it upside down and revealed all the flaws in the science and the thinking behind why fat wasn't the culprit in particularly heart disease and particularly saturated fat. So Can you talk about the origin story and what you discovered and the surprising things you found as you were researching your book that were like, oh my God, what happened? How did we get in this mess?
Yeah, so I mean, like any idea, the idea that fat and cholesterol are bad for you, they have their origin in a moment in time. We've been living with it for so long, we just kind of think it's always been true, but it hasn't. So it really started in the 1950s when the nation was in a panic over the rising tide of heart disease, had been pretty much non-existent in the early 1900s and had risen to become the #1 leading killer.
Are we paying attention to that? Pretty much non-existent prior to the 1950s, and now is the leading #1 killer. Why?
Right? Even President Eisenhower, 1955, has a heart attack he's out of the Oval Office for 10 days. Everybody's attention is fixed on this public health emergency. What causes heart disease? And there were a number of explanations. Maybe it was, auto exhaust. Maybe it was vitamin deficiency. Maybe it was the type A personality. Remember that? But there was one theory.
Which both of us probably have.
And we're still alive. There was one theory proposed by a physiologist by the name of Ansel Benjamin Keyes from the University of Minnesota, and it was his idea that it was saturated fats, the kind you find in animal foods, but also coconut oil, saturated fats and dietary cholesterol, think egg yolks, shellfish, that cause heart disease. And so that was called the diet heart hypothesis, right? So
there were some animal studies on rabbits who never eat that stuff and gave them high levels of cholesterol to eat, and they got heart disease. So, it's cholesterol in the arteries, so it must be the cholesterol we're eating and the fat we're eating.
I don't know, maybe it's because it's not the rabbit's natural diet.
Yeah, I mean...
And maybe we're suffering because it's not our natural diet to eat the shit that we've been told to eat all this time.
When you talk about the weak science behind, when he came up with this idea, it was just an idea. And there was a tiny bit of evidence behind it, including these animal studies where they gave rabbits a super high cholesterol diet and the rabbits got cholesterol in their blood. Well, rabbits are herbivores, they're not omnivores like we are. So, and so there was just like a little bit of piecemeal evidence out there, but it was this moment, there was this vacuum of information, and into that stepped Ansel Keyes with his diet heart hypothesis. Saturated fat, dietary cholesterol. He was this incredibly charismatic, powerful man who was, according to his peers, able to argue anyone to the death. He was called aggressive even by his friends. And he was really able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association, such that in 1961, the American Heart Association comes out with a recommendation saying, don't eat saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, cut back on meat, full fat dairy, cheese.
And meat was vilified because it contains saturated fat.
Because they contain saturated fat and they contain cholesterol, right?
Which, by the way, the saturated fat in meat is a specific kind that doesn't raise cholesterol called stearic acid.
Oh,
right,
how about that?
ironically. And meat, the kind of fat in an average like porterhouse steak, only a third of that is saturated. All foods contain a mixture of different kinds of fatty acids.
Olive oil is 20% saturated fat, right?
Mackerel has more saturated fat per 100 grams of fat than meat does. But it was just this really simplistic kind of science that they were using. And it was taking a stab at trying to prevent heart disease, but it became policy.
I think Nina is very kind when she says science because it's really science. And I think she gets to that in a couple minutes.
So that 1961 American Heart Association policy was the first time anywhere in the world that people were told cut back on meat, cheese, eggs in order to prevent a heart attack. And that was the beginning of it all. So it's really important to say that at that time, it wasn't a low-fat diet. They didn't say reduce fat overall. It was just saturated fat.
No, in fact, there was a lot of evidence around that time that carbohydrates were driving obesity, and carbohydrate restriction was a standard recommendation for weight loss.
What?
Yeah, and also for controlling diabetes. It was, in the early 1900s. And actually, there was a large amount of science in the early 1900s, mainly in Austria and Germany. And the story is that science disappeared with World War II. Those scientists kind of were dispersed. But they had done the science on showing how weight gain is really not controlled by energy in, energy out, calories in, calories out. It was really controlled by hormones.
Yes.
And they understood that.
Yes.
They didn't at that point understand that it was the insulin hormone, which turns out to be the most powerful hormone for fat deposition. But they understood there was something going that was controlling fat deposition that was not about calories. And then all that was lost.
Yeah.
That science. It was all written in German. And then the whole field of nutrition moved over to the United States, didn't read the German articles, and then was just lost.
So you catching that? This just blows my mind. One guy, Ansel Keys, can throw down his idea, and because he has such a persuasive personality and kind of an aggressive personality, he can convince all the people around him that his idea is actual science. Now, he did some studies. It's called the 7-country study. And that study was supposed to prove that saturated fat causes heart disease. What is rarely talked about, and I don't remember if Nina gets into this here, but what is not talked about is the fact that it was more like 22 countries, and none of the data supported his theory. So he cherry-picked the data to kind of make it look like it supported his theory. And here we fucking are.
So instead, center stage is Ansel Keys and his colleagues, and they become the most influential nutrition scientists of the 20th century. They're very closely tied in with the National Institutes of Health, that they're the people with all the money for all the research grants. They kind of take over the whole nutrition establishment, really. They're the editors at all the major journals. They're the top people at all the expert conferences.
And they suppressed dissent, right? Like
So
John Yudkin was another scientist at the time that was showing that sugar was really the driver of all the cardiovascular risk factors.
Yes.
And they completely silenced him, and he ended up sort of dying in disgrace at the end of his career, basically kicked out of his lab in London, and the high-fat crew didn't do well, and the low-fat crew ascended.
Well, these were like Yudkin, as you say, he was a...
Excuse me, sir. No, thank you.
Professor in London, at London University. His theory was that it was sugar that caused heart disease. And there was another man, MD in the U.S. called Stefansson, and he had traveled all over with the Inuit in the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, and he saw them being devastated by carbohydrates. So it was his theory that it was carbs and sugar. So there were these other thinkers with other hypotheses, and it is true that they were silenced. I mean, which is a shorthand way of saying like they were criticized. They were told that. Really in the same way that we see today. They're accused of being backed by industry. They were, their science was attacked. They were attacked. They couldn't get their papers published in journals. I mean, that's the way that science is silenced.
Yeah. And the data that...
Do you hear that? That is how science is silenced. These people, Ansel Keys and his gang of science thugs are shutting down people that have actual data that is proving that sugar is freaking toxic. they're like silencing all the people that have evidence that support to the contrary of what Ansel Keys is trying to say. So this is why I struggle when people say things like, Margie, it's science. Is it? Is it science? Because science should be unbiased. It should not have influence by major corporations that are going to benefit from the outcome of said science. It's like Nina and Dr. Hyman said at the beginning of this, scientists are supposed to have a theory, and they're supposed to try to prove themselves wrong. And it's gotten away from that, where the scientists are trying to, one, hang on to their funding, and two, trying to prove that they're right so that they can make a profit and support shareholders in whatever organization is backing them. Okay, let's carry on.
That Dr. Keys used was based on looking at patterns of consumption of foods in a certain number of countries in Europe. There were 7 countries. And it was just looking at correlation. And most people don't understand that science is not all the same. Science that shows correlation doesn't prove anything. It just shows a correlation. I could wake up every morning, the sun comes up. They have nothing to do with each other, but there's 100% correlation.
See? And that is not science. Correlation is not science.
I'd like to see the sun shines because of you, Mark.
Oh, thank you. But I don't think that's it. I don't believe that. And I think that they tried to follow up on that research because they believe the theory and they saw this association. But when they did the follow-up research, it was fascinating because they did a study that could never be done today that was unethical. It was 9,000 patients in mental institutions who were captive. They gave half of them high saturated fat diet and half of them vegetable oil or corn oil, and they were sure that the corn oil group would do better, have less heart attacks, less deaths. And in fact, their cholesterol dropped on the corn oil, but their heart attack rate and death rate was dramatically increased.
Pay
For every
attention to
20, 30 point drop.
You hear that? Okay, so this is the most controlled study that you can have, which is now unethical. They took patients from a sanitarium, I guess they called it back in the day, and fed them 2 certain kinds of diets. One with, well, let's back up and hear what that was. I don't want to back up. Dude, you got to leave me alone now. I'm busy. Let's just back up a smidge.
They did a study that could never be done today that was unethical. It was 9,000 patients in mental institutions who were captive. They gave half of them high saturated fat diet and half of them vegetable oil or corn oil, and they were sure that the corn oil group would do better, have less heart attacks, less deaths. And in fact, their cholesterol dropped on the corn oil, but their heart attack rate and death rate was dramatically increased. For every 20, 30 point drop in cholesterol, there was a 22% increase in heart attack and death. And they suppressed that data for 40 years.
They suppressed that data for 40 years. And really, we're still living with that bullshit data. But the whole cholesterol thing, that's going to have to be a whole nother video. But this is what I'm trying to make people understand, is that just because there is science that says something is a certain way, you have to look at the funding sources. You have to read like the entire paper. You have to take it with a grain of salt. We should be able to trust it. Oh, absolutely. We certainly should be able to trust it. But we can't because of this kind of shit. Because there's actual human beings that have some sort of a stake in the outcome of said science, whether it's money or their reputation or whatever. Humans are driving the science. We can't, if there was a way that we could, maybe AI, if there was a way to take humans out of the equation, then we could probably get a clear and true answer to scientific situations, equations, whatever. Anyway, back to the show.
because they didn't believe it and they didn't want to publish it. And it was just published a couple of years ago.
God, that pisses
So
me off.
yeah, that's the Minnesota Coronary Survey. Ansel Keys was one of the primary investigators, and you're right. It was the biggest, most ambitious test ever, funded by the National Institutes of Health, of his hypothesis, right? And at the end of that study, what happened was they did actually publish it in 1979. But that was 16 years after they had finished the study. So the study results come out, they don't publish them for 16 years. And they finally put it in this little out-of-the-way journal that they know nobody will read. And when one of the investigators was asked, why wait so long? Because it is, of course, a form of cheating in science not to publish your results. And
See? This is what I've been saying all along. It is a form of cheating to not publish your results.
he said, well, there was nothing wrong with our data. We were just so disappointed in the way it turned out.
But it wasn't there more data that came out?
So then, then in 2015, these researchers at NIH went back to that study, and they went back to the son of the investigator, and they found out that in the basement there were these magnetic tapes from the study that had never been fully analyzed, and they analyzed them and used special machines to try to get the data off of them, and they discovered that they had never published the full results. And so in 2015, they published the result that actually the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the higher their rate of dying from heart disease. So everything and this is the exact opposite.
And the butter group did better, basically.
And the butter group did better, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so, it's, and actually, so the story is, the bigger story is that study, the idea that study results are ignored, not published, that is not the only example of that. I mean,
and this was a
This is what I'm
randomized
saying.
control trial, which is the highest level of evidence. It's not like a population study where you can see a pattern, but you can't prove anything.
Right.
This data is more convincing.
Right. So this is the kind of data, randomized controlled clinical trial, gold standard of evidence. It's where you can demonstrate cause and effect, right? That's what they do for drug trials. They show they have to do a trial to show cause and effect. Otherwise, as you say, it's just this kind of weak observational data. That data relies entirely on people recording what they ate.
Right.
These food
Food
frequency
frequency
questionnaires. It's like,
yeah.
how many peaches did you eat in the last 6 months? Now, how many pears did you eat in the last 6 months? And then and repeat that for other 200 items on the list. And then
Somebody asked me what I ate yesterday. I can't even remember.
I can't remember what I ate this morning. So that data has been shown to be just notoriously unreliable, right? And they can't, and they've actually done tests on it, to see what do people actually eat and then what do they remember they ate. People, it's all confounded. Like the fatter you are, the more likely you are to lie about the data. I mean, it's really fascinating. But the point is,
It also depends on what the prevailing view is. If you think meat is bad and you eat meat, you're going to minimize your reporting of how much meat you eat.
Right,
That's
and you
right.
minimize your sugar. They've shown that people underreport how much sugar they eat, and
They
so-
overestimate the exercise and underreport the diet.
Well, that just sounds like human nature to me. But I
Yeah.
think that the point is that's really unreliable data. And that was the data that Ansel Keys used as the foundation for that first American Heart Association policy. But then, and that was in 1961. So what I want to say is that what happens after that 1961 policy is the government, the U.S. government, and governments around the world realize, okay, we have to test this more rigorously. So they did these trials, these government-funded trials, including this Minnesota Coronary Survey. They actually tested more than 75,000 people all over the world in a number of randomized controlled clinical trials. That's, again, gold standard of evidence. And I describe these trials in my book. I mean, they were, as you say, many of them, the kind of experiments you couldn't do anymore because they were in mental hospitals.
And yes, I have read her book, and it is good and infuriating, but good.
You're not allowed to do that anymore if you
Right.
force people their food. But they were really, that makes it very what we call well controlled, meaning you're controlling everything that everybody's eating. It's
Yeah.
not like giving somebody a diet book and saying,
Eat this, right.
Yeah, and then you don't know what really happens. So, and none of those experiments could show that replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils was able to prevent heart disease.
Hear that? None of those experiments showed that replacing dietary fat with corn oils reduced heart disease risk.
Or cardiovascular or death, right? None of them. One of them that was done in Australia showed that the men on the corn oil diet died at much higher rates than people on the regular diet. And none of those, I think the kind of the blockbuster thing to me, which I didn't even really know until after my book was published, is that none of those studies, the billions of dollars spent by governments around the world, none of those studies have ever been reviewed by our dietary guideline committees, which is our expert bodies making our national food policy.
What the fuck?
Extraordinary.
They've just ignored all those
Well, it's
trials.
like the best possible evidence on fat and saturated fat was completely ignored.
Completely
Paid for by
ignored.
taxpayers everywhere.
Right. And it's absent from our guidelines, which we're going to talk about. So,
Okay, so we're going to pause here for a second. This is Ansel Keys, who I literally don't like to waste emotion on anyone, but this dude is responsible for so much death, sickness, and disease that I can't help but hate this guy. So listen, this is how persuasive he is. This is some old stuff here.
Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
Okay, anyway, so I just wanted to demonstrate why I am so passionate about health and nutrition in eating whole, real foods, single ingredient foods, not highly processed packaged shit that has a big old ingredients list on it. And this is exactly why that is. You are not going to go wrong with eating meat and vegetables and butter and fat. You're going to feel better. You're going to live longer. What's another book that I've read? Eat Rich, Live Long by Ivor Cummins and, let's see. Yep, Ivor Cummins. And Jeff Gerber, who is a doctor. Ivor Cummins I follow him too, I love him. He is an engineer who loves to study data also. See, the people that are looking at the actual data are the people that I trust, not the people whose paychecks depend on how these outcomes play out. Or like Ansel Keys, whose ego is dependent on being right. Fuck you, Ansel. So this is a very good book. There's only, it was written it says 2018. I don't know if that's like a revision, because I do know that in this, I believe, if I remember correctly, in this book, they talk about eating what they call healthy oils, such as canola oil, which now we know is absolutely not healthy. I could be wrong on that, but I will put a link to this entire discussion in the show notes. It's an hour and 15 minutes long, but here's the thing. This stuff is so important, you guys. And I know that if you're not really into it, you can just be like, but I don't know. You don't have to actually sit and watch it, because it's just two people talking. You can turn it, even with stuff like that I'm saying to you, you can just turn it on and clean your house and just listen to it or whatever. But really, give a listen to some of these people, because they're going to explain things so much better than I do. And it's fascinating. And more than anything, our lives depend on it. With that, let food be thy medicine, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace. I just found my next documentary. Food is Freedom: How Washington's Food Subsidies Have Helped Make Americans Fat and Sick. Ooh, I can't wait to see that.